Lacan begins and ends this third lecture in Talking to Brick Walls on what I believe to be familiar terrain. The first bit of familiar terrain here is the topic of repetition. And Lacan starts by effectively summarizing his work on this concept to date. It's a concept that we've talked a lot about, and it's one that he sums up nicely on page 74 around the topic of repetition. And I think there are two crucial insights here. But first, let's consider the passage. Obviously, repetition can only begin with the second time, which turns out to be the one that inaugurates the repetition. If it weren't for the second, there would be no first time. This is the story of 0 and 1. Only with 1 there cannot be any repetition, such that for there to be repetition, I don't mean for it to be got underway, there has to be a third. First big insight that comes from this, a summative insight, is that repetition is retroactive. It's one we've discussed. Only with the emergence of a second can an earlier event be retro-effected as a first, namely an origin. And this isn't Lacan's great insight, it's Walter Benjamin's great insight about the nature of origins. They are retroactive. They are retro-effected at a later date. Only by returning to Berlin a second time can my only other trip to Berlin become my first trip to Berlin. And if you've got ears to hear, I'm referring back, of course, to Kierkegaard, who is arguably one of the first great modern thinkers prior to Benjamin on repetition. Prior to this return trip to Berlin, my earlier visit there could be called my first trip to Berlin under only two circumstances. First, if I was prefiguring a return visit in the future, for example, while planning a trip to Berlin, and I'm quoting from one of my friends who brought this up the other day. He said, the first time I went to Berlin, I got into Berghain by pretending to be deaf. This time, I'm going to get in by pretending to be blind. So it would be okay for him to talk about his first trip to Berlin because he's already planning his second. That would make sense. However, there's another way that the first trip to Berlin could find expression. This would be by following the signifier first with two more, and only. My first and only trip to Berlin. Insight number 2 is a little more elusive, but also puts us more directly on point with this third lecture in Talking to Brick Walls. Lacan tells us, in the passage you just heard, that it's the story of 0 and 1, but only if we add a third. What's he getting at here? The presence of 1, the number 1, allows for the emergence of a figure of absence, namely 0, the cipher among all ciphers, again from the Arabic sifr meaning empty, nothing, 0. Recalling, of course, Lacan's second lecture here in Talking to Brick Walls, where the term cipher pops very directly. But the number 1 is not a repetition of 0. Repetition only begins with the number 2, which technically speaking is the third number in this sequence. 0, 1, 2. 0, 1, 2. Lacan then turns to God in the next paragraph. We're not going to read it, but that's where he goes from here. And the reason we're not going to read it is because I think we can make more headway by sticking with Lacan, notably his earlier accounts of castration, because that, I believe, is ultimately what this third lecture is all about, and that second bit of familiar terrain on which this lecture ends. Now, there's a lot that happens in between the familiar terrain of repetition and the familiar terrain of castration. So we got a bit of work to do. But let's pause for a second and recall what we know about this notion of castration, this phenomenon of castration. As we've seen, the math is simple. phi minus phi equals obj a. Oh, whoa, hold up, man. Don't be tarping phi minus phi obj a. It sounds complicated, right? At this point, you know that it's not actually that complicated. Mathematically speaking, phi minus phi equals obj a is as simple as 1 minus 1 equals 0. The first one is the imaginary object, known in Lacan's pre-Oedipal theory as the imaginary phallus, usually written in the lowercase Greek phi, this little anatomically looking ball and cock image of lowercase Greek phi. That's our first one. It's whatever the pre-Oedipal child imagines the maternal figure to lack and hopes to become for them. That's what this little phi indicates, we've shown in previous series. Castration occurs when a third party, invoked by the maternal figure typically, cuts into this fantasy figuration, effectively denying mother and child alike access to this imaginary object, this imaginary phallus. And to the child, the paternal figure says, she doesn't have it, and you can't be it for her. Now, in Lacan's algebra, this operation is written as minus phi, a little subtraction sign in front of that lowercase Greek phi. Minus phi is the signifier here of the loss that the child sustains in this moment. This is the loss of an imaginary object, a loss which leaves behind an opening, a gap, a hole, a lack, a space where the imaginary object was that is now vacant. The algebraic symbol that we use to mark this absence, this vacancy, where nothing appears, where nothing is left behind, is obj a, which is every bit the 0 point of the child's transformation into a subject. And that 0 point language is important here. From the early 60s forward, Lacan thinks of obj a as a kind of 0 point of desire. It's a figure of lack. It is the 0 that we get when we subtract 1 from itself. 1 minus 1 equals 0. Phi minus phi equals obj a. And this is important because, again, it marks the transition from the pre-Oedipal child into the living subject, a living, embodied subject who experiences lack, which in turn begets desire, which in turn draws the subject toward all sorts of supplemental metonymic objects in hopes of finding something to plug that hole in their existence, the hole which, in fact, each of us is. Here's the problem, though. Nothing quite fits. Nothing quite stacks up to the imaginary phallic object that they lost. But they just keep trying, as we do, from one object of desire to the next, ever in search of fulfillment. Fulfillment in place of loss and lack. These supplemental objects can be numbered. Indeed, that's all they are, is a sequence. 1, 2, 3, and so on. And that's exactly how Lacan sees them, as supplementary surplus figures added to the original equation. 1 minus 1 equals 0, and 0 begets 1, 2, 3, and so on. Now you can see what he's up to here and how it impinges on his thinking around castration. Phi minus phi equals obj a, signifier of lack. And then the 1 and the 2 and the 3 and the numbers that follow are figures of objects we use to try and plug that hole, that lack, signaled by obj a. This is simple math. And I think by this simple math, which has a nice logical twist to it, what Lacan in this lecture calls Mathematico-Logic, you can see what he means in the second part of this passage on 74 that we just considered. This is the story of 0 and 1. Only with 1 there cannot be any repetition, such that for there to be repetition, I don't mean for it to be gotten underway. There has to be a third. The 1 in this sequence, from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 and so on, it does not repeat the 0 before it, but it nevertheless shows repetition underway. And I think that's an important little caveat that you hear on page 74 here. Repetition is nevertheless underway, even though the 1 doesn't repeat the 0. For what else is this 1 but a sublimated, metonymic stand-in for the original 1, the imaginary phallus, that was lost in the process of castration? We've been over this before. You've probably been over this 8 or 9 times in various series of lectures on Lacan. This is not news here, but it does comport precisely with where he starts this third lecture in January of 1972. Indeed, we worked out all of this in the first major diagram in our series on Seminar 16. So I'm not going to spend too much more time on it. If you want more on this, just check out that first diagram. It looks like the face of a clock. And you can work through each of the permutations and imagine the numbering sequence that would follow in a repetitive fashion once 2 follows 1 and begets 3. Just one more word, and then I'll shut up about it, I promise. Because I think it's the magic word in all of this. The word which is still with Lacan here in January 1972 in this third lecture on the psychoanalyst knowledge. What's that word? That word is surplus. Everything that comes after 0 in the sequence 1 minus 1 equals 0, 1, 2, 3, everything that comes after that 0 is a surplus from the Proto-Indo-European root verb meaning to fill. Supplement comes from the exact same verb as well, to fill. These objects are fillers, hopeful, but always failed. The number 1 that shows the repetitive logic of human subjectivity underway, as Lacan says, even if it doesn't repeat that 0. The 2 that repeats that 1, and the 3 that repeats that 2, and so on. Each of these sublimated metonymic objects, like every cigarette you've ever put in your mouth, every piece of clothing you've ever hung in your closet. And we could just keep going on listing objects of consumer capitalism. Call them commodities, if you will. Each of these things is an object for surplus enjoyment, exactly as we've defined this fallen, earthly, landlocked form of jouissance since our series on Seminar 16. I use the word jouissance here in quotation marks. Why? Because the jouissance that we see in surplus jouissance is a jouissance that only ever arrives in bits and pieces, crumbs of jouissance, more akin to desire, really, than anything we know by the name of enjoyment. And all at the level of phallic object relations. And when I say phallic, I want you to hear it in a very specific way. The fillers that the numbers 1, 2, and 3 in the sequence that follows the 0 point of human subjectivity known as Ch3a, they are fillers that always fail. That's why I want to call them phallic objects, because they are prone, inclined toward, tinged ever with failure. The fillers, remember, surplus, supplement, comes from the Proto-Indo-European root verb meaning to fill. The fillers in question here, whether it's an object you put in your mouth or one that you hang in your closet, they always fail. And in failing, condition more of the same practices, more of the same objects, each object being a repetition of the last. This is the second big insight in the passage where this third lecture in Talking to Brick Walls begins on repetition. Now, if you've got ears to hear, or at least eyes to see, how Lacan arrives at this notion of repetition in the lecture we're considering here, you know this talk of repetition began with Lacan talking about his seminar, what we now know in hindsight as what would become Seminar 19, titled Or Worse in the English, which Lacan says on pages 73 to 74 of the lecture we're considering is now underway. There's that expression again, underway. His other seminar, not this little miniature seminar that he's giving in and apparently to the chapel at St. Anne, but the other seminar, his proper seminar that he's giving in the Magnan Lecture Theater across town. It's underway. Why? Because at this point, on January 6th, 1972, which is where we find ourselves here in Talking to Brick Walls, and now you're starting to get a sense of what those brick walls are, Lacan had delivered the first 2 lectures in what we now know as Seminar 19. Notice how he figures this. It's on bottom of page 73, top of 74. They should also take account of the fact that since last time, I have got this seminar underway. I've got it underway, and if one is a little attentive and rigorous is an operative word here, one can say that this can be done just once. Effectively, it's done twice. And this is why I can say that I've got it underway, because were it not for the second time, there wouldn't be a first. So here it is. Underway. Why? Because if one has a little attention and a little rigor, one cannot say, let me correct that, one cannot say that this can be done just once. Effectively, it's done twice. And this is why I can say that I've got it underway, because were it not for a second time, there wouldn't be a first. Now you hear the slip, you note the slip. Can to cannot. It is absolutely about dynamis and adynamia here in 1972. What a bungled action, though, to have at this point, 15 or so minutes into this final lecture in our mini-series. Not coincidentally, it is also precisely the theme that gets Lacan going in this lecture from January 1972. This is totally where it gets interesting on my reading, because it's here in speaking to the group at St. Anne Hospital about the seminar he's delivering elsewhere that Lacan says he gets carried away. Check it out. It's on page 79, leading up to page 80, and it suggests that the path forward, the most successful path forward at this point, is at the level of the bungled action, the misread passage, or in this case, Lacan just getting a little bit carried away. In the end, it was speaking about my seminar that led me to get carried away. Here, Seminar 19. Not this seminar that he's giving to the folks at St. Anne, but his other, what we would here designate as his proper seminar. He's talking about that, and that leads him to get carried away. Since you are perhaps the same people, I spoke as though I were speaking to them, which led me to speak as though I were speaking about you. And who knows, this has led me to speak as though I were speaking to you. This was not remotely my intention, because I came to St. Anne to speak to psychiatrists, and quite clearly not all of you are psychiatrists. Anyhow, what is certain is that this is a bungled action. It's a bungled action that therefore runs the risk of being successful at any moment. That is, it could well be the case that I am indeed speaking to someone. How is one to know to whom I am speaking, especially when, at the end of the day, you count for something in this business, however hard I try? You count at least as much as I'm not speaking where I was counting on speaking, because I was counting on speaking in the Magnon Lecture Theater, and instead I'm speaking in the chapel. Now, you hear all this. Can you imagine being in person hearing all this? I'd be like, bro, what the fuck are you talking about? For real. He realizes this. Next paragraph, he tries to come clean in typical Lacanian fashion. What a to-do. Did you hear that? I'm speaking to the chapel. This is the response. I'm speaking to the chapel. That is, to the brick walls. This bungled action is becoming increasingly successful. Now I know to whom I've come to talk. To the very same I've always talked to at St. Anne, to brick walls. It's been an age. Every now and then I came back with a short lecture title on what I've been teaching, for example, and then a few others, which I'm not going to list. I've always been talking to brick walls here. Who is it who's got something to say? And then someone in the audience says this. We should all leave if you're talking to brick walls. Consider this. If indeed Lacan shows up here at St. Anne in the chapel to deliver these lectures on the psychoanalyst knowledge, if indeed, as he says in the second lecture, that he shows up as an analysand, we should not be surprised to hear him engaging in bungled actions and in highlighting as much. In fact, I would say this is precisely what happens when analysands speak in the clinic, which is to say, in the midst of the analytic discourse, which is truly, conceptually, the centerpiece of what we've been up to. What is produced in analytic experience, as determined by the analytic discourse, are symptomatic expressions. Don't get this twisted, my friends. And by symptomatic expressions, we mean bungled speech and action of every sort, including that which is on display here, now. Hence that S1 in the lower right-hand quadrant of this matheme. And that's exactly what the analytic discourse is when we write it out. It's a matheme. And I want you to hear this as a writing out, but also as a writing out. When the analytic discourse is written out, this is what we discover. In the final analysis, if you will, which always occurs on the page, the analytic discourse is a matheme. And the S1 in this matheme, as we know, signals a symptom. What Lacan adds to all of this here, in his third lecture, in this volume, for reasons I wonder about, being titled Talking to Brick Walls. I could think of some other titles, not least of which might be the psychoanalyst knowledge, but anyway, what he's adding here is an emphasis that is material, that according to him at the very end of this thing is not metaphorical either. He's adding an emphasis on the sonic effects of talking loudly in a space walled with bricks. Enter a cave and holler. Enter a gymnasium and holler. Enter a chapel and holler. What comes back to you is what we popularly know as an echo, a reverberation. This is what is added to what's happening here. And it's the best case for why this mini-series should be titled Talking to Brick Walls. But I also think this is also inadvertently the best argument for referring to it as the psychoanalyst knowledge, which we'll come to. Recall how Lacan arrives at this. It's in that weird little moment where he tries to clarify what the fuck he's been talking about around who am I speaking to? I don't know who I'm speaking to. It's like he's going to get out the sock puppets and start working through some shit. Remember what he says. Did you hear that? I speak to the chapel. This is the response. I'm speaking to the chapel, that is, to brick walls. The response in question here is not that of his audience, but that of his own voice, and with it his own bungled action, his own symptomatic speech, because remember, he's the analysand here, bouncing off the walls of the chapel as an echo. So start thinking in this direction, and I believe you'll be able to make some significant headway into the centerpieces of this final lecture of his. For me, this is why I so enjoyed his response to the person in the audience who said, "We should all leave if you're talking to brick walls." You'll note his reply. It's on the very next page, at the top of page 81. He just says, "Who's speaking to me?" Interesting. How are you going to read this? You could read it as a moment of ignorance. He doesn't know. Confusion. Another voice echoes off the walls. Where did it come from? I don't think that would be wise. I think this is one of those cases where you should not read his question, "Who's speaking to me?" as a moment of ignorance or confusion. On the contrary, because check out what happens a few pages later on pages 84 to 85. Before I started talking here, I did a good many other things at St. Anne. So here he's back to this list of things he did that he's not going to tell us about at St. Anne, if only by way of turning up each day and fulfilling my responsibilities. As far as my discourse is concerned, and you know what discourse is, Lacan's discourse, everything starts off from this, from simply turning up each day and fulfilling one's responsibilities. If I've been talking to brick walls, it's because I got down to it rather late, long before I heard what these walls were sending back to me, that is, my own voice preaching in the desert. This is a reply to the person who spoke about leaving. I heard things that were utterly decisive for me in any case, but this is my own business. I mean that those whose status confines them to these walls are quite capable of making themselves heard, provided the appropriate lugs are within earshot. So what does Lacan hear when he talks to brick walls? He hears his own voice, returning to him as an echo. This passage on echoes, on reverberations, it echoes throughout the rest of this lecture. Count them, 5, 6, 7 different references to reverberation all the way up until the very end. What we're talking about here doesn't need to be complicated. The same way that 1 minus 1 simply equals 0. An echo occurs when voices hit walls and bounce back in a rather new form, even if only because they bounce back at a later date. What we are dealing with at the level of an echo is a repetition with a difference. Conceptually speaking, this is precisely what we see happening in that littoral zone that we've been talking about, this palpable frontier, as Lacan keeps referring to it, between truth and knowledge, the real and the symbolic, sexual enjoyment and its landlocked surplus sibling. Notice how Lacan figures this. It's on page 96 in what I believe to be one of the key passages of this third lecture in Talking to Brick Walls. The wall is the site at which the turning back occurs. Now, we are talking about echoes here. The wall is the site at which a voice turns back. The wall is the site at which the turning back occurs, which the other day I introduced as the signifier of the junction between truth and knowledge. I'm not the one who said that there was a cut It was a poet from Papouasie who said there was a wall. But it's not a wall. It's simply the locus of castration. This means that knowledge leaves the field of truth intact and vice versa. Now, the first part of this passage is the one that is top for us, about the wall in which a turning back occurs, where we also see the junction between truth and knowledge. That is indeed the littoral zone, the intersectional spot between the two Euler circles of truth and knowledge that we've been working with. This latter bit about the locus of castration, which is not in fact a wall, is the insight we need to earn. We'll come back to it in a second, but for right now, just be clear. He is still thinking about the types of signifiers that rattle around in the intersectional zone between truth and knowledge, the real and the symbolic, sexual enjoyment and its surplus sibling. Let's ask the question then. What if we followed his lead? What if we took him at his word here? What if we read this passage a bit literally? What would it mean to introduce a series of walls, a series of echoes, into our understanding of the littoral zone between truth and knowledge? In order to think this through, I think it's important to recall some of the diagram work that we've been doing in this series and the series before it. It all starts, as you know, with a simple diagram with two Euler circles overlapping and producing an intersectional zone. This is that diagram that you've seen so many times, a couple times in this series, and then all throughout our series on Seminar 18. So if this is new to you, you know where to look to find this thing playing out. And if you want to draw this with me, which is I think a good idea, because some of you aren't going to be watching this video as I hold up diagrams and point you through them. Some of you are listening to this without access to the video channel for one reason or another. So you might just want to get out a sheet of paper and draw this yourself. First, draw one circle, and then draw another circle that overlaps a bit with the other circle, thereby creating three spaces. Two circles and then their overlap in an intersectional space, much as we see in this sloppy version of the Euler diagram, the classic one in Lacan from Seminar 11 forward, and that subsequent scholars have made such great use of, notably Bruce Fink. You can see these two circles overlapping, and they produce a third space, a space in between, an intersectional zone. And we've labeled these spaces as follows. The circle on the left, I want you to think of this as the sea, the ocean, the lake. Call it what you will. It's a body of water. The circle on the right, you know where I'm going with this. You've been here before. This is land. And what you see in between, it's really quite simple. It's the beach. What in environmental studies we call the littoral zone. What Lacan is toying with in Seminar 18 as the littoral zone, where letters wash up. And that's just the point we're after here. The field of land is the field of knowledge. The realm of the sea is the realm of truth. And you know what I mean by this. The further out to sea you go, the more you see the truths that can't be said. On land, with knowledge, we see the symbolic. At sea, we find the real. Now, some of you might bristle at these characterizations. That's cool, bristle all you want. This is for purposes of clarity. We are clarifying what Lacan is up to here in a way that I find coherent, logically sound, and true to his thought. So bristle all you want, but this is what I think he's talking about. On land, we also see surplus enjoyment. And at sea, we see its necessarily logically prohibited sibling, sexual jouissance. This beach in between is the littoral zone that Lacan's been talking about here now for about a year in his thought. And as I hold this up, you can see how each of the pieces play out. There's your sea, there's your land, and they overlap in this area known as the beach. And what this allows us to do, just like studying any beach, is to arrive at low water marks and high water marks. Where land reaches furthest out to sea, and you need only walk a beach to see all of this, by the way. This is not profound cartographic theory that I'm doing here. Where the land furthest reaches into the sea, we see low tide. When the waves are at their lowest point, there you see just how far land, where you can have soil under your feet, reaches out into that body of water. As you know, though, if you've ever walked a beach, especially with a large body of water, there's oftentimes a great distance between that low tide mark and the high water mark, the high tide mark, typically signaled by the way you see a curvy line of debris having washed up at high tide and gotten stuck. This is the furthest inland that the sea comes. So if low tide is the furthest the land gets out to sea, high tide is the furthest that the sea comes inland. Now, for some of you, this is old news. You've heard me work through this before. You've worked through this with me in our discussion sections. But for some of you, this is not. So I rehearse it here in the spirit of the echo. Here is the diagram that we've been working with. At low tide, we see the radical psychoanalytic theorist gathering up symptomatic expressions that have washed up and are now retreating back to sea. You've heard me talk about in this series. What we see, in other words, at high tide is the symptom, and what we see at low tide is the matheme. The speech of the analysand washes up at high tide in the form of debris, litter, letters, S1s. And then at low tide, you see the position of the analyst, particularly the radical analytic theorist, who is gathering up those bits and pieces of unconscious truth as they cough, wash, wave up, and forming them into mathemes, mathematical representations of the impasses that oftentimes pop up in analytic discourse. That's what the matheme is. And it's here in these lectures on the psychoanalyst knowledge that Lacan introduces the term matheme in precisely this way. It's a mathematical, logical formulation of impasse that can be tested, mind you. And you'll note this is a development from his earlier thought around the matheme, although he doesn't call it as such yet. He calls it like a formulation, the theoretical formulation that you see in Lacan's algebra, for instance. He thinks of all of these as ways of reaching into the remit of the real, of accounting for truths that are unconscious to analysands, but also for the truth of the unconscious itself that is the proper knowledge of the analyst. That's why, again, in the lower left-hand quadrant of the matheme of the discourse of the analyst, you see S2. Relative to the analyst, that means the analyst knows the truth of the unconscious. Now, that's not the only way to read S2, as we're going to find. But notice what's happened here. We are now transitioning away from the imagery work that we've been doing with the beach and land and sea and the familiar terrain of a high tide full of symptoms and a low tide full of mathemes. And what we're arriving at is that discourse, the discourse of discourses as far as Lacan is concerned. This is the discourse of the analyst, which I'm drawing now for you. If you're just listening, you can run a quick Google search. You know, it's good to mourn Google as it's on its way out as search. You can search the internet and find the Discourse of the Analyst if you don't already know by heart what this thing looks like. In the upper left-hand position of agent, you see objet A, for reasons that we've discussed at length. In the upper right-hand, in the position of addressee, which is also the one who does the talking, you see the barred subject. This is the analysand. In the lower right-hand quadrant, you see that S1 we were just referring to as symptom that is produced in the analytic discourse. And then in the lower left, you see the S2 that we just mentioned with an arrow pointing up to objet A, because that S2 is the truth that conditions the semblance of agency that we see when the analyst steps into the room as objet A. And it looks like this once more. You have the arrow conditioning the agent and the arrow conditioning the production. But in between, once more, there is a break. A delta of impotence shows up. Now, why am I rehearsing all of this? Because we're adding one more twist to this famous discourse, which according to Lacan is the discourse of discourses. And what I want to do is I want to take those two side arrows, the arrow that passes from the S2 up to the objet A, and the barred subject down to the S1. And I want to refigure these in ways that I think are quite illuminating. So if you redraw the discourse without those two side arrows, you get the standard drawing of this discourse of the analyst, which I hold up now for y'all to see. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these two side arrows and I'm going to expand them into the very Euler circles that we were just talking about in ways that I think are quite illuminating. Here's how it would work. The S2 in the lower left-hand quadrant of the discourse of the analyst, you know that it conditions the analyst's semblance of agency as objet A in all its permutations. And note, I'm asking you to recall all of the knowledge we've been working up here and to synthesize it into a point of almost being able to articulate it fluently. But that's what I'm asking. That's what I'm expecting. That's what I myself am trying to do here. If we take that arrow of causality, of conditionality from S2 to A, and we transform it into a circle that captures what happens in this moment, it would look something like this. It's the same arrow, same directionality, but it gives us one of our two Euler circles. In fact, it would be the circle of the symbolic, of society, knowledge, land, and surplus enjoyment of all things. Now, we're going to do the exact same thing. You've got the matheme for the analytic discourse in front of you, and now we're going to draw the second of those two Euler circles. And we're going to do it by taking the logic of production from the barred subject to that S1, from the analysand to the symptomatic expression, and we're going to expand that in the other direction to draw another circle from barred subject all the way around to S1, symptomatic expression. And so you're going to have our Euler diagram with the analytic discourse in between, defining once more the low tide mark and the high tide mark, where we see the analyst at low tide and the analysand at high tide. You see how we're working these diagrams. Everything still holds. The left-hand circle is the circle of truth, the real, sexual enjoyment. The right-hand circle is the circle of knowledge, the symbolic, surplus enjoyment. And in between, we see a littoral zone. All the same logics apply. What we also see, once more, is at low tide, the position of the analyst, sitting atop knowledge of the truth of the unconscious, you see? We also see on the right-hand side the analysand, speaking, coughing, emitting symptoms. Let me explain what I think is happening here in these two trajectories. In the trajectory of the analysand, from the barred subject with the Euler circle circling out toward S1, barred subject to S1, what we see here is the production of symptoms, as we know. I want to suggest it also marks a very certain sequence from the symbolic, where that arrow starts, to the real, out to C to the left where it trends, and then back into the symbolic, which is where it ends, pointed directly at that S1. So you can see what happens here. It starts in the field of the symbolic, in the field of knowledge, passes out to C into the field of truth, here unconscious truth, of which the analysand is ignorant, and then poof, washes back up, pops back up, coughs back up as an S1, as a symptom. What we see here, I believe, is an encircling, if you will, of that S2. That's what you see, in fact, at the very center of that analysand's circle is the S2. The analysand, as a barred subject, runs a circuit around their S2, which is the site of their unconscious truth. The unconscious truth that, unbeknownst to them, commands their symptomatic expression. So you can think of this as a transit from the barred subject into the unconscious truths of which they are ignorant, truths which nevertheless command their symptomatic expressions as S1. Now, there are lots of ways to read this. We've talked about this as the real taking a name in the symbolic. That still holds here. You can also think of this the very way that analysands undergo the procedure, from society to the formation of the unconscious out of all the bits and pieces of prohibition that society leverages and levels onto the subject, and then right back to the symptom. Society begets the unconscious, and the unconscious begets the symptom. And the logic here, again, is very simple. It's the logic of litter dropped in a river, rolling into a river from a landfill that then washes out to sea. Debris of civilization washes out into the unconscious, into the sea, only to then be washed back up at high tide. Really in any tide, but especially at high tide, because that's where it finds a landing spot back on land. Here is the bottle that went from land out to sea and then back to land again, the very same way that litter travels oftentimes from civilization on land out to sea and then washes back up in decrepit form as litter, as broken down bits, not as signifiers, but instead as letters, backwards, upside down letters, and the like. That's what happens in this process. Now, we can just as easily say almost the inverse around how the trajectory of the analyst unfolds here. This is the trajectory of the circle which goes from S2 all the way around into the field of land and knowledge and ends up back at Ch3a in the position of agent. Here it is. For those of you that are watching, you can see the arrow that I'm drawing here. It's the formation of another circle, another Euler circle that keeps us right on point with our original diagram. What we see here is a circuit from S2 as knowledge of the truth of the unconscious to the semblance of agency, conditioned and expressed when the analyst walks into the room as some version of Ch3a. This is also what results, not in symptoms, but in mathemes. That's what we also see occurring at what is equivalent here to a low water mark in the map that we've been working with, a topo of sorts. Knowledge of the truth of the unconscious, circling around and arriving back in the analyst's lap, ready for the production of mathemes. But notice also, just as the discourse of the analysand en route to the symptom runs a circuit around the unconscious truth that commands their speech and action, notice the trajectory of the analyst that starts with knowledge of the truth of the unconscious and circles all the way back around to land in the analyst's lap. It runs a circuit around S1. That is a crucial element here. The second trajectory we're working on, it runs its circuit around the symptom. The analyst's knowledge of the truth of the unconscious gathers up pieces of analysand speech as symptom and brings it to the analyst for the formation of mathemes. Now, this is an important development in a diagram that just started with us trying to account for the littoral zone. What Lacan has asked us to do is to take the analytic discourse, we've seen this in his series on the psychoanalyst knowledge, and put it in the palpable frontier between truth and knowledge. This is what happens when you take that discourse and all of its movements and you plug it into the map that we've been developing, this diagram of the littoral zone. And it reveals something very, very key, I believe. For the analysand, unconscious truth becomes the hub around which their symptomatic expressions circulate. And for the analyst, those symptomatic expressions of the analysand become the hub around which their mathemes circulate. So it's not just as simple as saying that at high tide symptoms wash up, and at low tide we see mathemes etched into the sand. It's not that simple. There's another more complex way to account for this. The mathemes that we see at low tide are formed, induced by, again, the symptomatic expressions of the analysand, these S2s that they circulate around. These S1s that they circulate around. And the opposite is true for the formation of those symptoms. They circulate around an S2 that is the unconscious truth that commands the barred subject's symptomatic expressions. Now, I don't know if that's simple, but by God if it isn't clear. And I would add that it is also hella coherent. This thing starts to hang together in exactly the way that I think Lacan is developing it here at the start of 1972.